Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to our professional development webinar series. Our goal in the series is to provide parish staff and volunteers, diocesan ministers, the formation, training, and the tools they need to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. That's why we're excited about today's webinar with William Simon. He is the author of Great Catholic Parishes, and he's going to be talking about 4 essential practices for great Catholic parishes that have come from his findings in a series of some research that he did for parishes and parish leaders like you. My name is Jared Dees. I'm the Digital Marketing Manager at Ave Maria Press, and I'll be moderating today's webinar along with Christina Pignon, the Parish Marketing Coordinator.
Hello everyone. Before we begin our webinar, we would like to recognize our webinar partners, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils.
As always, everyone in the audience is muted, but you can ask questions, and we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to offer questions to our presenter. You can find the questions section of the GoToWebinar panel displayed on the screen here. I'd also like to note the webinar is being recorded, and a recording will be sent to you later this week via email, so watch your inboxes. So with that, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Bill Simon. He's the founder and chairman of Parish Catalyst. In addition to Great Catholic Parishes, he's also the author with Michael Novak of Living the Call, an Introduction to the Lay Vocation. Simon is co-chairman of the investment firm William E. Simon and Sons and the William E. Simon Foundation, and serves on the board of numerous philanthropic and charitable endeavors. He and his family live in Los Angeles, California. So Bill, thanks so much for being with us and presenting today.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Christina, and thanks to all of you that have joined this webinar. It's a pleasure, it's a privilege to be here, and I'll try my best to be brief and succinct, which, as my wife sometimes tells me, that's a challenge. And we'd also welcome any of your questions at any point, as Jared mentioned. So my journey began by way of background.
Before you start, Bill, I'm just going to have you open up your presentation. If you can click the little button that's popped up in the window and says "Show my screen," and then we'll get
sure.
Slides.
Sorry.
We just have a little trouble locating the
The
button.
mouse. I don't know. Hold on. Sorry.
It's okay.
There you go. Tammy.
Oh, is it there? Okay, just click on it. What do we do now, Jared?
So if you're ready, I can hand over controls back over to you, and then.
Okay.
All right. And I'll have a pop-up window that says "Show my screen," and then we'll be able to see your slideshow rather than mine.
Okay, we're good.
There we go.
We all set, Jared?
Yep.
So you let me know when it's okay to go.
All set.
Okay, great. So thanks, everybody. Thanks to you, Jared. Thanks, Christina. And just to go into a little bit of background, back in 2011, I wrote a book called Living the Call with a friend of mine named Michael Novak. And it was all about, the wonderful opportunities that are available to lay people in the Catholic Church. And during the context of that book, where we profiled 8 lay people that were active in various capacities in the Catholic Church, I discovered how much was going on at the parish level that was very, very fulfilling to people, very important work. As we'll talk a little bit about later in this webinar, how important parish life is to the Church, how important parish life is really to the world as a whole. And it was really that discovery that led me to conduct the research that's become part of this book, Great Catholic Parishes, that we're going to talk about today. And I might say that I'm a little bit superstitious, but the book is doing pretty well. It's now close to the top of the Amazon new release list. And I'm always a little bit superstitious about talking about how well the book's doing. I ran for public office about 15 years ago, and I was always cautioned on talking about polls because you never know, they're up and they're down. And we had an expression which we used, which was, if Moses had taken a poll, he'd still be in Egypt. So I hesitate to tell you how well the book's doing, but it's really more by way of saying we're quite pleased with the research. We're quite pleased with how the book's come out. We're grateful to Jared and Christina and their colleagues at Ave Maria Press. Now, one of the areas that I focused on in the first book with Michael, and we focus on in this book, and we'll go into it at greater length in a minute, is this idea that the church has changed dramatically at the parish level and for lay people over the last, let's say, 50 years. I'm 65. Now, when I grew up, the mantra for lay people was pray, pay, and obey. And, we used to joke about it that, once we prayed, paid, and obeyed, that was about it. Today, it's totally different for lots of reasons. The decline in vocations, the recognition that lay people have lots of skills that they can offer, the modern day parish. So we want to highlight right off the bat that this notion that the church has changed quite a bit over the last couple of decades in terms of parish life and maybe in other places as well. And I asked myself the question when I was doing the first book, I wonder what makes some parishes flourish. And it became a little bit of a pet project for me, because where we worship at St. Monica's in Santa Monica, we have a very flourishing parish. Just to give you an idea, and many of you may know about St. Monica's and its wonderful pastor, Lloyd Torgerson. We moved to California from New Jersey 26 years ago, and we came upon St. Monica's as a result of a recommendation from a friend. We were immediately impressed with a lot of things about St. Monica's, and during that ensuing 26-year period, the parish has grown from 2,000 families approximately to today, it's almost 11,000 families. So lots of good things going on at St. Monica's. And I was curious, what it was that made St. Monica's, flourish. I was curious what St. Monica's out there. And so when I wrote this first book with Michael, another friend of mine called me and said, you might want to explore what I've done in the evangelical tradition at the equivalent, at the parish level. What I did was I got together really strong, vibrant ministers and their senior staffs in a protocol called, shared learning. And we've been doing this 30 years, and we've had dramatic results. And so you ought to explore that. Maybe in the Catholic tradition, you might want to do something like that. And that telephone conversation really was providential for me. And I began to explore, is this doable? The idea that you might identify vibrant parishes like a St. Monica's and bring them together. So in effect, you'd have 10 or 12 St. Monica's with 10 or 12 pastors, 10 or 12 groups of their senior staffs, and basically put them in a room for 4 meetings over 18 months, and maybe there would be dramatic outcomes. And that's what we found. So that's getting a little bit ahead of the story, that now fast forward 3 years later to today, we've now had 2 cohorts all the way run through these 4 meetings. We got a 3rd cohort that's in the middle of their 4 meetings, and we got a 4th one that's starting in the middle of October. So we decided, Claire Henning and I, Claire is our executive director at Parish Catalyst, has been with me since day 1. Without Claire, there would be no book. There would be no Parish Catalyst. So Claire and I, as a first step 3 years ago, tried to identify some parishes that might be good candidates for this protocol. And so we identified 100 parishes by a technique that's sometimes referred to in the academic world as semi-structured snowball sampling. I'll come back to why this technique's important in a second. But we came up with 100 parishes all over this country. And we then put together a 32-question protocol, and we began to interview the pastors. And we, with their permission, with the pastor's permission, we taped the interviews. We transcribed the interviews. We came up with over 3,600 pages of transcripts. And we then spent 18 months analyzing those transcripts. We came up with 49 findings. We grouped those 49 findings under 4 categories. And let me assure you that it wasn't just me and Claire. Claire has a doctorate in pastoral ministry. I don't have a doctorate in pastoral ministry. We had others as well that have doctorates in sociology and masters in pastoral theology and pastoral ministry. So we had professionals analyzing this data. I sat at the table too. I myself did 80 of the interviews. We believe, and it's probably immodest to say this, but I hope you'll excuse me, we believe this is the most comprehensive, academically rigorous study ever undertaken with respect to the Catholic parish. One of the reasons we believe that to be the case, not just the 3,600 pages of transcripts, was because of the 244 pastors that we interviewed, they represented an 82% response rate from the 290 that we invited. Now, an 82% response rate is unheard of, as many of you probably know, in the academic world, whether you're talking about a religious piece of research, whether it's sociological, whether it's anthropological, whether it's political science that you're talking about. So what we did when we identified the top, not the top, but the vibrant 100, let's call it, because there's plenty more than 100. There's plenty more than the 244. At the end of the protocol, we would always say, are there other parishes that you think are innovative, energetic, vibrant? That's how we grew from 100 to 244. So our goal was to try to gather together, as I mentioned, and as you see in the slide, these innovators, to get them together with one another. We ultimately interviewed 244 from all over the country. And you'll see in the book, Great Catholic Parishes, that the demographic of these 244 parishes roughly mirrors the overall Catholic Church, whether it be, the profile pastors, average age, the ethnic demographics. So I viewed this as providential. We didn't start out thinking that we would mirror the demographic, but we did. And our interviews are from every state in the country. So I mentioned a moment ago, 49 findings. We group them under 4 categories. The first category is leadership. And I would say that if there were 12 findings, which there are, under that first category of leadership, one word could characterize the sum and substance of those 12 findings. And that word is shared. 80% of our 244 pastors talked about the fact that their leadership style was to share it with lay people. Now we go back to that first slide, pray, pay, and obey. Obviously there is a huge sea change between 1965 and before and today. And it's all about sharing in one way or another. It's about sharing in a collaborative way, sharing by delegating, sharing by consulting. And we found that in this area, these vibrant parishes not only shared either in these one of 3 ways or sometimes a combination. They encouraged the growth of ministries. So most of these vibrant parishes had 60, 70, 80, 90 ministries. At St. Monica's, as an example, there are 120 ministries. Out of the 120 ministries, 115 are run by lay people. So let's talk now about the second theme. So we have the first theme with 12 findings. We have leadership. In the second theme, vibrant parishes talk about focusing and fostering spiritual maturity and a plan for discipleship. Now, that once again is a change from years and years ago. Not so much a change in intention, but more a change in execution. So we found that 90% of the parishes spoke about one of their great strengths as being spiritual maturity. But 75% of the pastors in our database said, yes, we're proud of our spiritual growth as a strength and a plan for discipleship, but we think we can improve. I viewed that as a very honest assessment. We're doing good, but we can get better. And one of the areas that they talked about, one of our findings, is that historically, and even into the present day, most denominations have very low engagement. So you don't need to look any further than Matt Kelly in our beloved Catholic tradition, to Willow Creek, Bill Hybels, South Barrington, Illinois, who wrote a book called Move, meaning move the people along the spiritual path, or to the Catholic Leadership Institute, all of which we talk about in the book, that have something called the Disciple Maker Index. All of these different approaches to measuring spiritual formation, and a term they often use, engagement. The levels are low. Let me give you an example. At these 244 parishes, the average level of engagement, measured often by the Gallup Corporation using a tool called the ME25, was 30%. Nationally, Gallup has used this tool at over 900 Catholic parishes, and the average level of engagement is 18%. Matthew Kelly, in his book, 4 Signs of a Dynamic Catholic, says that the average engagement level in his universe is 7%. Bill Hybels said 15%. Disciple Maker Index, Catholic Leadership Institute says 3 or 4%. So now I'm an investment person by career. In my investment career, our firm often talks about the chance to double, meaning if you put up $1 million, what's the chance you can double that to $2 million over what time frame? And I thought to myself 3 years ago when I first became aware of these engagement numbers, that the chance to double from, let's say, 10 or 15, that should be pretty doable. The chance to double from, let's say, 40 or 50, now that is going to be a tough assignment. So when we talk about our second finding, lots of times in our book, we talk about the challenges that our pastors and our parishes face, whether it be with leadership, whether it be for spiritual formation, and we'll talk about the other two in a second. So one of the great challenges in terms of engagement is that you have to strategically and intentionally focus on spiritual formation and discipleship. So now, the third theme, great parishes excel on Sundays. Here we had 13 findings. And if I was going to point to one of my favorites, kind of a common theme of these 13 findings, I'd say that a great Sunday experience does not begin on Sunday. In these vibrant parishes, it begins on Monday. It begins on Monday with social media. It begins on Monday with small groups, whether it be Alpha, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, or some other intentional small group. And it goes through the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So that by the time Sunday rolls around, a lot of the parish has already been engaged. Now, one person you'll hear quoted in the book, who's become an old friend of Parish Catalyst, his name is Rick Warren. I know many of you have heard of Rick. He loves the Catholic faith. He's an evangelical. He's got a big church he started from scratch down in Saddleback, Southern California, not far from where we are today. And what Rick says about small groups, he said the larger that we became at Saddleback, the smaller we had to become. And at his church, if you can imagine, he has 25,000 people come to Saddleback on the weekend. During the week, that Monday through Saturday, he has 40,000 people come. My pastor said that is an incredible statistic. But he said, and our findings confirm this, that the more you focus on small groups and the more you focus on weekday activities and the more you focus on social media, the more vibrant your parish is going to be and the more attendance you're going to have on the weekend. Now let's talk for a sec about Sunday, because the Sunday experience is obviously key. And as Catholics, we're so proud and so grateful that we have the Eucharist, which is the source and summit of everything in our Catholic faith. But one of our findings was that when we pull up to the church as parishioners, we're welcomed. It doesn't just occur at the front steps of the church. Often, we are met in our cars by ushers, by people that know us, by people that say, geez, are your children going to Sunday school this morning? My wife and I breathed a sigh of relief when we were able to hand off our lovely children, who we love dearly, to the Sunday school teacher. Then when we got to the footsteps of the church, we're welcomed again. We walk in the church, and what are the two words that we heard in our data set from pastors over and over and over again? Over 50% of our pastors talked about two things: preaching, music. The importance of preaching, the importance of preparation, which then dovetails with another finding, which is that pastor self-care is crucial, because pastors are busy. I don't need to tell all of you how busy our pastors are and how much they need help, whether it be in the form of sharing leadership, whether it be in self-care. They've got to take a day, maybe a half a day, to prepare their homilies. That's what our pastors were telling us. Music. Good music, our principal finding is that one size does not fit all. And you have to be sensitive to your audience. Doesn't mean that the music can't still be sacred. Yes, it needs to be sacred. But there's lots of different ways we have found that you can be sacred. And then finally, what's a great challenge to the Sunday experience? The Sunday experience is only a Sunday experience if people come to church. And obviously these days, there's a secularism that's taken place, and there's competing priorities, which when I was growing up, Sunday was a very important sacred day. And you rested, you went to church, and that was about it. My wife and I have 4 kids. I'll admit to you that we sometimes use Sundays for for football practice, piano lessons, that's the music, and for catch up on your schoolwork. Maybe have a tutor come over if one of your children's going to take the college entrance exam. It's very difficult, and that's why a Sunday experience now is so important, because otherwise you're going to be swallowed up by the secular culture. Now, the fourth area, probably my favorite, is that great parishes evangelize. Once again, this is a sea change. I will admit to you, growing up, I didn't feel that we were raised to evangelize. Now, or maybe that was just my fault. But I think historically Catholics have not been good at evangelizing. We have been reluctant to be wearing our faith on our sleeve. Well, I think times have changed. You'll see in the book, we write a chapter on the history of the American Catholic parish, and I learned a lot in researching and writing that chapter. And one of the areas that I was particularly interested was how these parishes sprung up to begin with. And by and large in the 1800s, the way these parishes sprung up was that they were enclaves of people that had come from another country. So in New York, you'd have an Irish parish. In Chicago, you might have a Polish parish. In California, yes, you would have a Hispanic parish. The fact is that when people came over from other countries, they didn't always feel welcome. So when the Irish came over in the 1840s, you all remember, those signs in New York City, Irish need not apply. So it's not surprising to me in our research that parishes grew to be enclaves of sometimes insular communities to preserve their custom and practice from their land of origin, to feel comfortable that they were welcome. Totally understandable. But as the years roll by, and I will give you another statistic that I thought was kind of interesting. When our country was founded in 1776, only 2% of the nation was Catholic. By 1850, 25% of the nation was Catholic because there were waves of immigrants. And that's actually been the case virtually since 1850. We're still about 25%, a little bit lower now depending on the survey, 24, 23%. So when people say to me, the Catholic Church is dying in America, they're only being propped up by immigration. Well, I learned in our research they've been propped up for 200 years, and I don't see it ending anytime soon. So I think that the parish has been a vibrant place that over time has changed character. On the cover of our book, Great Catholic Parishes, you'll see at the top a living. Now we all know what mosaics are. They're tiles that are fixed in a, some type of a sticking cement, and together they paint a picture. Well, a parish is a living mosaic where those tiles over time can change character, and they have, because over the last 60, 70, 80 years, we Catholics have been assimilated into American society. Nobody could have predicted that 100 years ago there would be 6 members of the U.S. Supreme Court out of 9 that were Catholic, that we would have had a Catholic president, many members of Congress and the Senate, many CEOs. You never see a sign anymore that says Irish need not apply. So we Catholics, in my opinion, have no excuse anymore for being reluctant to evangelize. And so I was heartened by our research, which showed that approximately 50% of our 244 parishes viewed evangelization as a great strength, as a great area of focus. And another almost 50% said, we got to get better. We can get better. It's the same, ladies and gentlemen, as that finding with respect to spiritual growth, where 90% of the parishes said they're proud of their spiritual growth, and 75% of that same 90% said we got to get better. There's a lot more to do. We're only 30% engaged, and even though we're above the national average, we should get to 50. It's the same in the area of evangelization. So let me give you one more finding. You're probably thinking, when is he going to be quiet and stop talking about findings and numbers? Well, at the risk of, making your eyes gloss over, I'm going to give you one more finding, and then we're going to open it up to questions. There's been a lot of talk over the last 3 years about the Pope Francis effect. You read about it, various studies, some op-eds. It was one op-ed in the New York Times last week. I didn't agree with it, but they said that there's no Francis effect, zero Francis effect. Attendance has gone down. I'm not aware of any studies that were academically airtight and rigorous as ours. So for me, it's speculation. Having said that, there is a Francis effect here, and this is what it is. I mentioned at the start, we had a protocol of 32 questions. Of those 32 questions, there was not one question about Pope Francis. Partly that was because Pope Francis had not become Pope when we started interviewing. Partly that was because we didn't think to ask about the Pope. Probably we should have. So there was not one question amongst the 32 that related to a Pope or Pope Francis. However, one out of every 3 pastors mentioned Pope Francis. So I think this is a Pope Francis effect. And here's what unanimously, or virtually unanimously, the third of the 244 pastors spoke about the Pope. They were excited, they were inspired, and they were heartened by Pope Francis's language regarding the parish being a field hospital, where when the wounded come in, the first question that you ask as a doctor in that field hospital is not, do you have your insurance card? Your first question is, how can I help you? And Pope Francis talks about pastors, and I know that you all are familiar with this. I don't mean to say things you already know. But Pope Francis has already spoken numerous times about pastors taking on the smell of the sheep. He's encouraged pastors, and really everybody, to get out of the parish, to move out and evangelize, to move out and engage in outreach, to do things that maybe they didn't do when I was growing up, to do things that maybe are uncomfortable. So when we talk about a Francis effect, my bet is that if we had asked every pastor, all 244, what do you think about Pope Francis? I think that more than a third would have been very complimentary, because this we know. A third did mention him, having not been asked. So for me, I think that's a tremendous Pope Francis effect. So these are our 4 findings, or our 4 themes, encompassing our 49 findings. Leadership, spiritual formation, Sunday experience, and evangelization. And let me close with this. I mentioned a moment ago that a good friend of Parish Catalyst, and thankfully a good friend of mine, has become Rick Warren. I'm going to borrow something that Rick said. And Rick told me that everything that he talks about, he is poached from someone else. And I said, Rick, I think I'd like to poach this from you. And he said, blessings on you, my brother. So here's what Rick said. He said and says that the local church, the parish, is the greatest engine for good in human history. He has 8 reasons why. I won't go through them all. But I think we would be able to guess a lot of them. The track record. 2,000 years of doing good things. And whether that living mosaic was like it was back in the, after Christ died, or whether it's more like today. It's changed over the centuries, but it's still doing good with billions of people all over this country and all over the world. About 2 years ago, Rick went to the country of Rwanda because he felt called to go there to see what he could do to help out with the AIDS crisis, which apparently was systemic all through the country. And since he'd written a famous book, Purpose-Driven Life, he was able to get an appointment with the president of Rwanda. And according to Rick, the president said, "Thank you for coming, Pastor Rick. Who can I introduce you to? I can introduce you to any politician, any leader, anybody in business, anybody working with a governmental agency, whoever you want to meet, I'll make it happen on this trip. Thank you for coming." And you know what Rick said? Rick said, "I want to meet pastors. They are the greatest distribution system for good that's ever been invented in history. So for me, ladies and gentlemen, I feel lucky to be part of Parish Catalyst. I feel lucky to have participated in writing this book together with our team, Claire Henning, Tammy Georgieff, Tamara Black, many others over these 3 years that have ensued since we first started doing our research. So with that, why don't I close it up and open it up for questions, and thank you again.
Well, thank you, Bill. Before I begin, do you want to say anything about, while we look for some questions, do you want to say anything about Parish Catalyst? Where can they find out more about Parish Catalyst? We'll come back and mention this at the very end of the Q&A as well, but feel free to just let us know the best places for them to go to find out more.
You know, Jared, I'm glad you mentioned that because I think I was supposed to mention that before I ended my talk. So I put up a slide now that says discussion guides, and our executive director of Parish Catalyst has put together these discussion guides. Once again, her name's Claire Henning. You can see on your computer screen they're free downloads, and this is a long-winded way of saying that our website is parishcatalyst.org, if you can see that. And there are discussion guides for parish leaders, for parishioners, small groups, and book clubs, and then for pastors. And, you know, we would encourage you to check these out, obviously encourage you to buy the book. You know, feel free to contact us at any point. There's places on the parishcatalyst.org website that, you know, you can get a hold of us. You can nominate parishes. You can call us. You know, I could give you our phone number right now. 310-500-4280 is one. There's another one listed on the website. And we're also active on social media. So the slide we have now, of course, is the address for our website. And then on social media, which our team is desperately trying to bring me up to speed, you know, we're active on Facebook. We'd really appreciate it if you like us. And we're active on Twitter and on Instagram with the same address, at Parish Catalyst. And, you know, so thank you, Jared, for saving my bacon with, you know, my colleagues here at Parish Catalyst.
Sorry, I had a question from someone this weekend at a conference. They saw your picture. We had the book out in display, and they wanted to know more about what Parish Catalyst does. So besides the book, what are some of the things that because you've been doing this before, long before the book, for a couple of years before the book had come out. What's Parish Catalyst up to? What are you most excited about?
Well, we're excited because, you know, we continue to have cohorts of parishes come, and the way it works is, you know, we identify, you know, 10 to 12 parishes that we think might be good candidates, and we call them, and we invite them to consider it. And since we've interviewed, you know, 244 already, we have a lot of parishes that already know about us, but we go outside. We've now interviewed over, I think, probably 300 parishes at this point. And then what happens is we have a protocol of 4 meetings over 18 months. And for the first meeting, all the meetings are in Los Angeles at a hotel right near the airport, so it's easy in, easy out. And they come for the first meeting. It's a 2-day meeting, and it's on a particular theme. The 3 themes we've had thus far are leadership development, millennials, and discipleship development. So we bring in speakers and facilitators, you know, to participate in these meetings. And at the end of the first meeting, each parish of the 10 to 12, the pastors working with their senior staffs with the help of a facilitator and, you know, the ideas that come up through the speakers, set goals. And the next meeting takes place 6 months later, and they report out. First thing they do in the second meeting is they report. So there's a little accountability there. There's a little human nature. You know, pastors don't like to appear as if they haven't accomplished their goals to their fellow pastors from all over the country. And it's the same for the staff. And then at the end of the second meeting, they set another set of goals. Third meeting, same. Fourth meeting, same. Report out in the beginning, set new goals. And then after that last meeting, there's a series of conversations that take place between the parishes and our staff. We call them check-in calls, and they actually take place between the meetings too. But after that last meeting, there's a way to check in and to continue to measure their progress.
Thanks, Bill. I just know from talking with pastors, they want to know other parishes that are doing great things that are really exceptional. And I love that your model is unique in that you're able to add that accountability with parishes that are doing great work. So thanks for the work and the ministry you do. So we're going to turn to some questions that we have here in the audience. A couple have come in already. I'm going to ask the first, then Christina's going to throw one at you, Bill. One is about the pastors sharing leadership. And Marcy specifically asked, did you find any correlation with the age of the pastor in the shared leadership in parishes?
The average age of the pastors in our 244 was 60. And so it kind of roughly mirrored the national average, which I think is 61. I think what we saw, we didn't quantify it, but we definitely saw kind of a trend that younger pastors were not as anxious to share leadership. So what do I mean by younger pastor? Probably someone in their 30s up to mid-40s. And after the mid-40s, they were much more willing to share leadership. Now, it may be that the pastors in the older category of, let's call it 45 to 65, grew up in a generation we might call it the Vatican II generation, versus the younger pastors that really grew up in the John Paul II generation, where maybe that was a little bit more conservative. In fact, I was on a radio show, you mentioned one at the top, Jared. I interviewed with Cardinal Dolan last Tuesday. Mm-hmm. And so anyone who heard that interview, the first question that Cardinal Dolan asked me was, is there a divide between liberal and conservative parishes? And I said, Your Eminence, I wouldn't say there's a divide. I would say there are different approaches. So I would say that the younger pastors, tend to be a little bit, more conservative, and the older pastors not so conservative. Now, I heard not an insignificant number of older pastors say that they felt that the younger pastors would evolve. Because when you've been a pastor for 30, 40 years sometimes, you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of pain and suffering. You've seen a lot of that field hospital that Pope Francis talks about. So I'm not suggesting that there's any doctrinal issues. It's really more an approach. So when you say shared leadership, well, I think as pastors get older, they might be more willing to share leadership because of the realities. Maybe there's not as many other priests in the rectory. Maybe they've gotten to know some really capable, competent lay people. So I hope that answers your question, Jared.
It does. I like that you dispelled the kind of the political nature of parishes, and I think that's a great way of looking at it instead. Christina, you got another question for him?
Yes, I do. I have one from Ronald, and he's asking a question regarding small faith groups. Was there a key method or practice that led to a growth of these groups in the parishes in your research?
Yes. I would say that we take a look. Let's take as an example, Ronald, and thank you for this question because I think this is one of the great findings of the book and one of the great, really, realities today, and that is that if you look at a faith group, so we looked at Alpha quite a bit, and they are experiencing explosive growth. It started in the Episcopalian tradition, and it's now moved over to the Catholic tradition, and there's actually a group called Alpha in a Catholic context. I'd encourage you to look at other similarly, look at the track record of some of the other small groups. So right now I know where we are, and I'm from New Jersey, as I mentioned. Cornerstone retreats are experiencing great growth because I come from a big Irish Catholic family. I'm one of 7 children. You may know Cornerstone retreats, and you may know that if you're going to participate in one, you ask your 4 or 5 closest friends or members of your family either to come with you or write you a note. So I've had, of 6 siblings, I think I've had 5 of them go through Cornerstone retreats. I filled out a lot of those forms. And so I'd say Cornerstone is good. Curcio, I hear really good things about. We mention a lot of them in the book, so I think maybe the full answer to your question is in the book, and I don't mean to be selling the book, of course I am, but the ones that immediately spring to mind off the top of my head are Alpha, Curcio, and what was the third one? I forget. But if you know that, if you hear of something local that is experiencing good growth and pastors are saying you really got to give this a try, I'd go with it. I'd go with it.
Yeah, and our parish, Christ News' parish, is something that's basically similar to Curcio. There's some really good models out there. Bill, we have a question about from Jasmine. So a lot of the people here in the audience are they're pastoral leaders, and not necessarily pastor. We've got pastors here, we've got pastoral leaders, and Jasmine's asking from her perspective, what would you say to someone who might not agree about giving over ownership or leadership to the lay people in the church, the lay leaders?
I'd say that give them a copy of the book, and because the data, I think, speaks for itself. I mean, that's where I don't claim to be as eloquent as Matthew Kelly. In fact, I would claim that I am not as eloquent as Matthew Kelly. I think the data should be the focus. And, if you give them the book, or you can quote from the book and say 80% of pastors are sharing. Now, you may say, and I would understand, maybe this pastor's not going to be so open to that. Maybe there's other things you can do in your parish. For example, we have a seminary out here, St. John's, and there was an event raising money for St. John's last week, and one of the people that was honored was a nun out here who's done a lot of great work in the parish. She was asked the same question. And she's older, so obviously in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s when she was particularly active, maybe not the 40s, but she said she had to look around. But there were plenty of things. There are plenty of places, to be active. I sympathize with your conundrum. That's why I wrote the first book, Living the Call, just to highlight anybody who asks that question. There's a lot out there. At some places you may have to hunt around. At St. Monica's, you don't have to hunt around. Now, there's some people that just the mere fact that they're not allowed to do certain things, turns them off. I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't tell the story of my wife, who I love dearly, I've been married to for many years, but, she sometimes is put off by the limited role that she feels in the church. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. She attended St. Monica's for 15 years before becoming Catholic. She wasn't Catholic when we first got married, and at one point, 15 years after we first started going, she said, "I've got good news, honey, but I want you to know one thing." And I said, "That's great. What's the good news?" She said, "I want to become Catholic." I said, "That's fantastic. So what's the one thing?" She said, "It had nothing to do with you." And, that's God's honest truth. I love my wife. So she's somebody who, sometimes you have to quietly make suggestions, maybe not quietly, maybe by example. So if you have a reluctant pastor, if you will, and there's plenty of them out there, so 20% of our database are reluctant. So 80% share leadership, 20% do not. So out of 20, so that's, kind of 44, pastors, 20% of 244, they're not going to share leadership. What are you going to do? Well, there's a lot of organizations that, affect parish life. Maybe there's other things for you to do in the church. That's, so I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. Christina?
Thank you. Let's see. We have one from Patty, and she said that she's looking forward to meeting you in LA for LA Congress, and she says, her question is, what has been your biggest surprise in the findings in your research?
Well, my biggest surprise out of the 49 findings, there's a lot of surprises, to be honest with you. Most of them, as a guess, I'd say 2/3 of them were common sense. So, they were great. They reinforced what our common sense might already say. Of the 1/3 that were maybe either not common sense or surprising, let me mention two. I already talked about one. That's the Francis effect. I thought that was fantastic. That might have been the biggest surprise, but once again, maybe that was common sense because, Pope Francis has experienced a lot of popularity in lots of places now. Some are upset with his economic pronouncements, and, I always say, last I checked, Pope Francis was not Secretary of Treasury, and he wasn't Chairman of the Federal Reserve. He's the Pope. And, but I think in areas of pastoral life, I'm not sure that's a surprising finding, but it was a great one. Another finding that was surprising to me, but once again, it might be common sense, but I didn't mention it yet, so perhaps I could, take a minute and talk about it. That finding was the profound effect that perpetual adoration had on a church's attendance, offertory, and spiritual growth. So we didn't ask any questions, just like with the Pope. We didn't ask any questions on perpetual adoration. I think about 25% voluntarily, spontaneously brought up perpetual adoration. Now we might say, well, why is that surprising? I mean, it seems like, well, it's one of the things that distinguishes our great faith, and one way that we could be so grateful that we have the Eucharist. Well, my response would be, well, if it's so obvious, how come everybody doesn't do it? It doesn't cost any money. It doesn't really cost any staff because they staff it with parishioners, most of these parishes. So I thought it was terrific that adoration. Now at our church, I've been bragging about St. Monica's, and we only do it first Friday every month. I said to Monsignor Torgerson, you ought to do it every day. And he said, you're right. Now he's doing a lot of other things. Maybe he won't get to it. But I think that for me, that was a very profound finding that our faith, there's a real basis for our faith, particularly as the Eucharist being, the core, as the Eucharist being the source and summit. I mean, there is a reason why Rick Warren thinks the Catholic tradition is fantastic. There's a reason he speaks at a lot of Catholic conferences. He loves Catholicism.
Well, thanks, Bill. We've got some more questions, but honestly, I'd like to end on that one because I think, what's more powerful than, like you said, than the source of summit. And I also just want to thank you. I think this book is really going to be a welcomed resource because, I think you've said already, it's going to be for pastors a permission slip to be able to hand over some leadership over. It's going to be permission slip for those lay leaders to step up and be evangelizing, to start those, spiritual formation. Permission to have Eucharistic adoration because look what it does for parishes that are great. So thanks, Bill, for today and for the book and for all that you're doing for Parish Catalyst.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Christina. And thanks to everybody on the call. God bless you and have a great day.
Thanks. Before everybody goes, I just want to make sure we talk about the book real quickly. Just say, as always, you're welcome to purchase a copy at Ave Maria Press. If you use the promo code webinar10 for today's date, you can get 20% off. The book's also available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere books are sold, both in print and an ebook.
And before we sign off, we would like to thank our partners once again, the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association of Catholic Family Life Ministers, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. If you're not familiar with these organizations, please check out their websites, which you can see displayed on your screen here.
Well, you can get a recording of this webinar and all the webinars we've done for the last 6 years or so now. You can find them on Vimeo.com, YouTube.com. On YouTube.com also you'll find the interview that Bill mentioned before that he did with Cardinal Dolan last week, which I think was really insightful as well. And you can find the recordings of the webinar though at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos.
Please mark your calendars for the next webinar in the Professional Development Series on Tuesday, October 11th 2016. Dr. Timothy O'Malley from the Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame will join us to share some insights into the newly updated order of celebrating matrimony.
Well, thanks everybody, and thanks again, Bill. Have a great afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you next week.